Founded in 1835 as the capital city of the newly created state of Victoria, the city of Melbourne is today regarded as one of the richest and most vibrant cities in the world, owed in no small part to the wealth of the gold rush in the 1850s, as an influx of migrants brought with them a host of new technologies, ideas, and cultural perspectives from Europe. Today Melbourne is home to over 4.25 million people, hailing from countless different cultural backgrounds, giving Melbourne a well-deserved reputation as a city born out of diversity. Currently, Melbourne is one of the most expensive cities globally to live in, with the global EIU index placing Melbourne as the 5th most costly place to live in the world. As well as this, it is also ranked in the top 10 most livable cities in the world, meaning that the idea of migrating to Melbourne can be a very attractive idea for people looking to move. Particularly since the end of the Second World War, large amount of European migrants seeking refuge from the devastation have travelled to Melbourne. As well as this, from the 1970s onwards, Asian migrant numbers have also increased, as the Korean and Vietnam Wars forced many people to migrate. Since the 1990s, Melbourne has maintained substantial population and economic growth, as international investments in the city's industries from international corporations not only boost economic growth, but also levels of immigration as workers move their families closer to their jobs. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Melbourne has had the highest levels of population growth and urban expansion than any other city in Australia. It is because of this continuing growth that Melbourne needs to find an alternative solution to population boom, and this is where our weekly reading comes into play. Prediction of population increases beyond 5 million people led the way for the creation of the Melbourne at 5 million strategy, designed to better prepare the city for a sustainable form of growth, both economically and the physical expansion of the city. The main issue of population boom as a general idea is that because of such a massive influx of people into one relatively small area, resources are often unable to sustain the entirety of the population. Things such as space, food, water, and other basic needs, as well as more contemporary needs like jobs and positions in schools and hospitals, become more sought after, putting pressure on the population to either adapt or collapse. The population boom of Melbourne, coupled with the economic downturn, is having multiple negative effects, with the lack of available jobs and an increasing urban density putting strain on the city. Overall, the main issue is being able to provide for an increasing number of people, both in relation to availability of jobs, access to resources, and also in regards to space and the ability to move quickly from one side of the city to another. With the rising population and the strain these places, the main problem for planners is being able to find a sustainable solution that not only benefits the city but doesn't compromise its reputation as a global, livable, and wealthy city.
In this week's reading, Goodman, a senior lecturer in planning at RMIT, argues that the constant change to plans, in particular Melbourne 2030, undermines strategic planning and can be costly from both a pragmatic and principled point of view. The Melbourne 2030 plan was identified as a strategy for the sustainable growth of Melbourne. Its aim was to redirect new development into existing areas such as activity centres, rather than to expand outward. Public concern has been expressed by anti-planning lobbyists regarding the effect that the urban growth boundary may have on the housing affordability. However, the relationship between housing prices and planning is not so simple. Government policies such as building and safety regulations add to the cost of housing, making it more expensive. Transport costs must also be incorporated for car-dependent suburbs, having to travel greater distances for access to employment and essential services. Goodman argues it would be more worthwhile to concentrate on increasing well-planned infill housing in better serviced areas. The moving of the urban growth boundary for a third time would suggest that strategies are negotiable, which in turn will encourage land speculation and land banking. By continuing to move the boundary, it is expected that there will only be more lobbying and pressure, as such matters are now seen as flexible rather than necessary. The idea of focusing resources and investment into existing centres has always been an accepted planning policy, being a part of Melbourne's first planning scheme of 1954 and the 1980s district centre policy. However, in Melbourne 2030, it was recognised that too many centres had been designated, providing little direction and focus for serious investment. Goodman believes it would be beneficial for the government to study the failures of past policies. She she emphasized the need to both widen government commitment to the policy and to stop approving exceptions to it. Goodman's main objective is that the recent change to planning policies sends the wrong message about planning to the community. It displays planning as continually negotiable, that plans cannot be enforced or given sufficient time. Goodman believes that though new trends must be taken into account, it is vital that strategies are given enough time to be effective. However, this does not mean 2 or 3 years, but much longer so that the strategy can be appropriately judged. Goodman's view on the Melbourne 2030 plan is that it should not be as flexible as in the past. Instead of encouraging negotiations over development outcomes, some matters should be made mandatory. As a planner, Goodman feels planning is critical to public policy. However, accepts that aspiring planners are finding difficulty in believing they can make a significant contribution to a more sustainable future, while the state government continues to back down on policies.
The Melbourne 2030 plan at heart aimed to promote high-density living through limiting the development of the urban growth boundary. An opening issue discussed is that surrounding the lack of direction and legislation to ensure plans such as the Melbourne 2030 are followed. With no solid or grounding legislation, often these plans only become initially implemented before being overturned for a change in direction which can see the full potential of the plan not being achieved. This links closely to the conflicting directions of planners, stating that a push toward urban consolidation is required to sustain our growth, which is projected through the Melbourne 2030 approach, whilst at the same time the government is making a push for the expansion of urban growth boundaries, which conflicts with the informed planning directions, once again bringing up the debate for greater legislation. One of the initial criticisms of the high-density developments in the Melbourne 2030 project is the cost. It is perceived that these high-density apartment buildings, etc., would be much more expensive and costly than that of the traditional suburban household development. This high-density criticism pairs with the problems for families wishing to establish a family home in a suburban area. With a large push for the limitation of the urban growth boundary, it can be foreseen to become more difficult for suburban land and housing to be available, with families, couples and individuals being forced to move inner city despite personal desires. A growth in population requires a growth in transportation infrastructure. The Melbourne 2030 direction for building up the large service centres requires improvement on transport. The large centres require good accessibility, something which is a great issue in Victoria. Current transport issues are poor accessibility in outer areas, such as those proposed for the large service centres, as well as already congested rail lines and peak services, both in the inner city and outer suburban areas.
Despite the large number of limitations to the Melbourne 2030 model, the implementation of a solution is actually quite simple, as transformation can be achieved through the realisation of existing approaches to planning schemes. What has happened to our planning schemes is that they have actually been incrementally added to and changed over the decades, and have become somewhat unintelligible and ambiguous, even for those in the planning industry. Therefore, our solution is to firmly tell individuals where they can develop and where it is undesirable. For this reason, all previous planning schemes need to be pushed back and an entire new planning scheme needs to be developed. Once this clear scheme has been designed and implemented, it needs to be stuck to without wavering, as well as allowing up to 10 years for the strategy to begin to take full effect. Further to this is the completing of individual elements of the plan so they are able to work in tandem together. For example, improving accessibility to activity centres through the implementation of public transport, enabling the community to see the full effects of the planning scheme in action. A crucial aspect of developing a comprehensive new plan to replace Melbourne 2030 is to engage with the community in our efforts to fix these problems of being incredibly indecisive. It is crucial that trust is restored within the community which was lost due to the constant indecision of changing plans. Re-engaging the community in order to restore trust levels involves developing strategies that can be easily understood, instead of handing the community a complex and in-depth plan that is difficult for the layperson to understand. Our solution is to present the community with a visual representation like this, which visually and easily conveys the change that will be visible in their neighbourhood. With increases in technology, we now have mechanisms that can talk to the community around changes through illustrations of the street, rather than a document which most people are unable to understand. For example, at this stage, the community might start to get worried about the changing character of the street. However, when presented with an option like this, they may perceive this to be the best option. By giving the community this variety of options, the community can make an informed decision on how their local area is to progress. This approach is in contrast to the current system, whereby a community receives a document that is difficult to understand, and when they receive the results of this document, they are often disappointed. Once this comprehensive plan has been developed with the community consultation, legislation must be put in place to make urban growth boundaries difficult to overturn to prevent further urban sprawl. Furthermore, legislation must be put in place to stop conflicting directions of the planners and government's visions, which lead to different messages being sent in regards to density and other planning debates. This further emphasises the urgent need to legislate in these areas and give strict areas of power to each individual body. We feel that this increased community involvement, increases in legislation, and sticking to the plan that is well thought out will lead to more efficient and effective planning schemes that will ultimately improve the standard of living for all Melburnians.